Um, I'm sorry about how long this took. One moment. Okay, I have like multiple versions of this thing open. So I was supposed to be back on hosting the other session, not realizing that I'm also the regular host of this one. So that's why I'm sorry I got my wires crossed. We figured it out. Okay, I'm inviting people on screen. There we go.
Hi. You see me on screen, Ashley?
Yeah, can you see?
Hey.
Hey. Hi. Great. Okay. All right, we're live. This is it. It's happening. Okay. So
I think a lot of people have the wrong link.
Yeah, I know a lot of my friends are just like, what room am I supposed to be in?
So did you? What is the link that you guys were sending?
So the
people?
one in the schedule, the link for room 2, I realized after is the same link as room 1.
Oh, okay. So there's like a 1 for the room 1 and a 2 for the room 2, right? Okay.
Yeah. So didn't realize that until a little too late.
Maybe send it if I don't know if you hop in the other room and just let them know what's the correct.
Yeah, and just say that if anyone's interested in the trainee perspectives, then this is it.
So I can't do that because I don't want to.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Mess with that.
I'm on it.
I just don't. I don't want to make Crowdcast upset. So since I'm like back in, because everything will just collapse. Anyway, okay.
Let us know when that's done, Elvisha, and then we'll get started. And I'm just going to very quickly check if there's a Twitter chatter about this or not.
Aman asked if she's supposed to be on screen. Aman, we're just gonna like briefly set the container first, and then yeah, we can like invite people on screen and do all that stuff. I can jump off or whatever. Just bear with us while we solve our technical debacle. Good.
Okay. Let me just put it in our Slack channel. Sorry, you guys can get started while I just throw these in.
Okay. So this is like the most emergent of all the emergent sessions, because it just came like a couple hours ago. We were just chatting on Twitter, and then we got this idea like, yeah, we should. Hajer and Elvisha were suggesting we do this session talking about the trainee perspective on the future of conferences, because obviously there's a lot of other sorts of perspectives out there, but the trainee one is one that might not get discussed as often. So that's kind of where we're at. Does it have its own consciousness? Does the trainee perspective have its own consciousness?
I would say yes, Michelle, but a lot of neuroscientists are really iffy about the consciousness word.
Good question. Do we do intros or just briefly? I don't know. Yeah.
Go for it.
You guys want to go first?
Go for it, Aki, since you started.
Okay. So my name is Aki Nikoladis. I'm the chair of the OSCIG for like 2 more days. That'll be the past chair. And yeah, we run this open science stuff. I think most of you guys have interacted with me in some way, shape, or form. I used to be in the student postdoc SIG. I'm like I care deeply about the trainee issues and the problem that like all PIs are training everybody for a career in academia, which only like 2 to 5% of people will actually end up doing. So and I also am a little salty that like undergrads get career fairs and who basically have no skills, but graduate students don't get career fairs even though they have like amazingly employable skill sets. Yeah, my boss says I should be a union organizer for the lab.
You probably should be.
Yeah. All right.
My name is Hajer Nakua. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I am the current chair, like Ashley said, for another 2 more days of the Student and Postdoc Special Interest Group. And I'm really sad not to be the chair anymore because I really love the experience. But similar to Ashley, I'm also really passionate about making sure that trainees get the experience that they want and not an experience that is imposed on them by old researchers.
I'm Elvisha Dhamala, and I am a postdoc at Yale University. and I am the social coordinator for, I guess, 2 more days for the student and postdoc SIG.
We're about to all go out to pasture in our glorious retirement.
Right? Until we find our way back somehow in another committee or something.
Yeah, you join
Somehow, some way.
Yeah, come to the Open Science SIG. We'll just switch around.
And then just go back, just back and forth.
Switcheroo.
Yeah. So I think that there's probably there are definitely a lot of people that are in the audience. I can jump off at any time and invite people on. We'll just have kind of like a live popcorn discussion. People will throw in comments in the chat, and then the people who are up on stage will try to respond. I can create polls, so if you have a poll suggestion, let me know. Definitely we're gonna probably discuss things like what's the format of conferences, what's like a big thing obviously is the cost structure of conferences, right? Which I was like trying to point at in the previous thing about the future of conferences, but like is a big deal actually when you're paid $19,000 a year as a grad student and you have to front all of the bills for your entire conference payment because the university won't pay ahead of time. You have to pay all of it. It's like, and to go to OHBM, if it's an international conference, could cost you basically like a third of your entire, income for the year, like several grand or whatever. So, thinking about that kind of thing, like, there are not everybody makes like, 50K or above or whatever in the field. So, yeah.
Definitely. And I think, another thing is for a lot of people, you just think, oh, you put it on a credit card, easy, you don't have to think about it. But that is coming from a very privileged perspective to have access to that. And like you said, a lot of times, when I was a grad student, like we wouldn't get our refunds back for up to like 2 or 3 months after. And you just like wait around and it's like, am I going to get paid? Will I have enough money for rent? Like, how am I supposed to balance all of this?
Oh man. Yeah. Colin just says 1 year he had to spend $5,000 on OHBM up to his credit card limit, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
It adds up really quickly. Like if it's international, Colin, like you said, we pay the interest. It really adds up, and it's like flights can be $1,000. Then staying somewhere for a week is another $1,000. Registration adds up, and then you're also paying for food and everything else while you're there, and it adds up so quickly that it's hard to even imagine before you go to your first conference how bad that financial hit will be.
And like one of the things we're always talking about is inclusivity of people who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? Well, how are you supposed to exactly do this if you don't, come from like some kind of privileged socioeconomic background? Are you
and have enough cash beyond like a paycheck to paycheck life, which most graduate students live. And not to mention, a lot of supervisors don't have the funds to allow their graduate students to go to international conferences. So I had one friend in Rome, she paid for her flight out of pocket because her supervisor said that I don't have the funds for an international conference this year. So these are important questions that need to be addressed, and they disproportionately affect the trainee just because the trainees don't make as much, obviously, as faculty members. And they're also sort of at the mercy of the funding organizations and what they fund their supervisor. And so there's just they don't have a lot of power to make a lot of these decisions, but they're affected by them substantially.
Michelle brings up a great point. Also, if you're a young parent, a parent with young kids, basically the cost goes even greater. I think overall this kind of question is pointing to what sorts of versions of conferences can we imagine where if you don't have money, you're not going to take a career hit, like a huge career hit, right?
Exactly.
Ideally you want to be able to show up at the conference that's a digital conference and present your work and give a talk and everything like that, and everyone's going to be like, wow, that's really great what you did, but you do it for free or for very low cost or something like that.
I think one thing that has been discussed many, many times throughout this week, which is it's good, it means that people are really thinking about it, are what are the type of hybrid models that we can do. And I think there seems to be a convergence of a main in-person conference that can happen internationally in addition to regional hubs which mean that many people can still present their work, put that on the CV, connect with people outside their institutions, but they don't need to travel very far. And so part of the discussion today is like, how do trainees feel about that? And what are the types of considerations that trainees really want to think about, even when it comes to things like a hybrid approach? Because one trend that I notice is, the older generation sort of really experiences the love of in-person conferences. And so they have a really hard time letting go of all the benefits of the in-person conferences and think that like, it's okay, things just work itself out, like come to OHBM when you can. And then there seems to be another approach where everyone is like really only virtual conferences to make it super accessible. We don't need in-person conferences. And so what I fear, at least, is sort of a polarization effect, where we find ourselves discussing this false dichotomy. It can only be in person, just like the old days, or it can only be virtual, like in a post-pandemic world. And so it's really important to think about, what does it look like if we bring it together, and how does it affect the trainees, which make up more than 50% of OHBM. Got some stats for you. #scientist.
Thank you.
We looked into this. Oh, do you want to go for it?
2020 OHBM, 54.5% of attendees were students and postdocs. So that was close to 2,000 out of the 3,600. And this was the virtual format last year. And 2019, which was the last in-person conference that we had in Rome, the numbers were actually even higher, where it was close to 60% of all OHBM members were students and postdocs, as well as 60% of attendees. And that was, again, similar to around the 2,000 mark. And I think it's important to recognize that if trainees are representing 50 to 60% of the members and attendees, we should have a lot more representation and a lot more voices at the tables that are making these decisions.
Definitely. I would love to invite some of the people in the audience on screen.
Absolutely.
If people, I'm just gonna send invites, and if people you don't want to come on screen, just reject my invite. That's all. Don't worry about it. Instead of like me figuring out, sussing out all who wants to come on screen. All right.
You want to invite Michelle? I think she'll have a lot of nice things to say.
Yeah.
I put you on the spot, Michelle. I'm sorry.
I always want to invite Michelle.
Michelle's great. But I think her point about like open science, CSIG, and student postdoc SIG coming together is so important, because these are not issues that we can all tackle individually, and they're not issues that affect us separately. We need to work together to figure out a coherent solution that sort of works for everyone, because a lot of times it's easy to say, okay, well, we'll do this for one group and that'll work for everyone. Hey.
Hi. Hello.
Oh, did Aki leave?
I'm just going to go off so that more people so we can hear more voices. I'm just going to go back into the background.
Okay.
I'm on.
Hey.
Hi. And to touch on Elvisha's point, I think in addition to coming together as the different SIDs, which, in many ways are kind of carrying the conference, but don't tell the council I said that. I do think that it's very clear that what the SIDs do are really welcome and appreciated by the community. And so in addition to coming together, I think one of the bigger challenges for all the SIDs is, how do we make sure this is an actual transnational conference that is considering people around the world? More stats for you, but we looked into the registrations last year, and there were 13 trainees from South America, 6 from South Asia, and 0 from Africa. And that was 0.0096% of the total trainee populations. And that doesn't mean that the trainees in those areas just don't exist or they don't want to come to OHBM, but it's more of like, how do we create conferences that, remove the barriers such as cost, travel, networking, knowing people, that can allow the trainees to come and benefit, since they're the ones that are going to be carrying the field.
I think we need to be learning from conferences like Neuromatch, where they've solved a lot of these issues. And actually a lot of like climate science conferences and other places that have been forced to go online because of the pandemic, but have also had the foresight to know that we need to have better models. There's just so many good examples and so much literature out there now of a lot of it to do with sustainability, but that also crosses over into accessibility as well. So I think we need to bring all of that together and learn all of the lessons that people have learned over this period, and then try and make it as sustainable and accessible as possible.
Absolutely. And adding on to Hajer's point, I want to also point out that the locations where larger conferences typically happen, obviously we have a restriction, or we used to with the in-person part, about needing large venues where we can have that many people. And a lot of these large venues tend to be in larger cities at sort of like wealthier countries. But these also mean that these are countries that a lot of our trainees from those countries have to go through an additional visa process. And that's extra money that's spent, extra time, extra resources. And a lot of those times, those costs aren't even compensated for. So we're just adding more and more barriers that make it harder. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I wanted you to complete. I was going to ask a question after.
I was just going to say, like, it's just more and more barriers, and we can't try to figure out how the conference itself can be accessible if we don't first think about getting to the conference itself for people.
So to follow up with that, Elvisha, I've myself have been, I've chaired the Student and Postdoc SIG, and I've now part of the diversity committee. And I really have my hands in all the different committees because diversity has a vote in all those committees. So my question is, given that I've known from the start, and I know now too, that the student and postdocs really make up 50% or more of the OHBM membership. What would they like to see? Because, oftentimes what happens is a council and the other committees try to make decisions like how to maybe enhance participation from Africa. We're thinking of maybe even removing membership fees for Africa, for example. But what does the student and postdoc community want to see happen? Like, do they want in-person conference? Do they want just online? Do they want the option of both? Because it feels like we make decisions at the council and other committee levels, but it would be best to have that open discussion like we're having right now. So we can take that information and go, this is what the majority of people felt that was needed, So do we have any responses for that?
Stefan,
I have a question. And that is, like, have we actually polled the whole membership about these questions? Because that feels like a good place to start.
We haven't polled the whole membership, but the CSIG has been hosting roundtables to ask people how they imagine the post-pandemic conferences to look like. And I think there is a plan to ask the whole membership. My worry actually is that having just come out of, not just come out of the pandemic, we're still very much within the pandemic, but having just had all of these virtual meetings 2 years in a row, people have this real strong desire to see people in person, that might be a bit of a backlash, that people are like, no, we just need to see everybody. In terms of asking the membership, I'm not sure if it's
you could still be able to capture some nuance. So there has to be some effort put into how the questions are structured and which type of questions. And the necessary voices have to be heard in constructing this type of poll. But I think, a roundtable discussion does not represent necessarily the whole group.
No, not at all. And there definitely is plans to ask the wider membership. But of course, what happens is there's always a selection bias, right?
I was just going to say that.
Some people have a very strong opinion on either of the spectrum, and so it's hard to gauge. But it's also there. We should also acknowledge that there are certain constraints, financial and otherwise, that need to be taken into account. So we do need to have a really open dialogue with council as well, to ensure that, we could all come up with a sort of absolutely ideal scenario of something that might not be possible for various reasons.
And I would.
We just did the climate, the OHBM climate survey. We got only 171 responses back. And that was mostly from North America and maybe Australia, some from Europe. So, we talk about surveys, we talk about the voices, but we need to hear those voices when we're sending out the surveys. Otherwise, we're just going blind. We might have a little bit more knowledge, but that's it. So then it's a little bit unfair, maybe when council, I'm saying council, but it really filters down to all the committees, like when we are basing our decisions based on the little feedback we get back, of course we're going to be wrong, right? So is there a way to get the student and postdoc trainees to be more involved, to really respond? Like even like a 40% response rate is better than whatever 171 respondents we got. I mean, I really appreciate the people who took the time to respond back, but we know we have a lot more members.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something that the student and postdoc SIG will definitely meet about and try to make sure that we strategize as to how we can get more responses. I think the challenge, though, is that, as I mentioned earlier, it seems to be like methods are pitted against each other. It's like it's only going to be in person or it's only going to be virtual. And so with either one, you get a really strong reaction from the other side. And a lot of the people in the middle are not going to be heard because it's like, oh, I sort of like this intermediate one. And then people are going to ask, but what does that look like? We don't know. It's too hard. Cancel it. No, we have to stick to the ones that we know. And so one of the things that Elvisha and I were talking about yesterday is this idea of like being open to reimagining what conferences look like. Like I think that there is no like pre and post that we can only stick to those constraints that we just made up. We can just be whatever it is that we want it to be. We can have hybrid models. We can do virtual sometimes, in person sometimes. And I think allowing that dynamic flow, make sure that we're also meeting the needs of different people, as Colin was mentioning in the chat, and as many people will resonate. Like virtual is not always easy, especially if one has many kids around the house, and a lot of people were telling me like it's hard for them not to work during a virtual meeting because it doesn't feel like you're really in a meeting, and so they work a lot and then they get burnt out, and so those are all very real concerns. So it's like if we can just remove the shackles that we have in our mind and totally reinvent what can conferences be with, like, we can start very complicated and then, work our way towards parsimonious solutions. And if we are going to have a survey, it's important that we capture that it isn't like a 3-poll question. Mm-hmm. Hey, which one do you like more? Because all the biases with Likert scales. And so we just want to make sure that nuance is captured, and then we can reinvent things. And another thing, my last point, I know I talked a lot this like little bit, but oh man, I just read the chat and I forgot what I was about to say.
Oh no.
Someone go ahead. I'll think about it.
So I'm going to say something.
Okay, go ahead, Bob.
So I wanted to say, like we say that going online will make it accessible to everyone. And I agree to maybe 80% of that. Have we thought about like network speeds in African countries? Have we thought about network speeds in like other countries? Like, is it really going to make it accessible? And if not, how do we really make it accessible? Like, I think like coming, and I say, even though I came from India and I don't consider myself privileged, but having lived in North America now, I think I've become privileged. I don't consider a lot of the problems like electricity going off, even if they have the internet speed. Like my brother is in India still. Sometimes I just don't get to speak to him because there's no power. So, like, have we considered these things when we say that online only is going to make it fully accessible? So these are things that need to be considered, because I think what we're talking about as being fully accessible might be coming from a privileged point of view as well.
Absolutely. And sorry, go ahead, Hajer.
No, I was going to say super quickly. The point that you raised is really important, because a lot of the times what's happening in a lot of these discussions, probably is happening right now, is that it is, individuals from North America and Europe who come from pretty rich institutions sort of deciding what is and what isn't accessible. And this happens in the in-person conference, and this happens within the virtual conference space as well. And so one of the challenges now is, how do we make sure that our friends and colleagues from South America and Africa and different countries in Asia are part of this discussion? And of course, the survey is one of them, but it really is important for us not to impose and instead just inquire about what is accessible and what is not accessible.
I think, so I mentioned in the chat, but I think it would be really useful if a lot of the SIGs came together in some kind of brain hack type way, that we could really get to grips with what the issues and the constraints are. So, for example, with the hybrid model, we were talking about this in the council roundtable, that there are some logistical issues and some financial issues when it comes to, having lots of mini conferences all around the world. And Aman brought up as well the fact that you need to then get a load of volunteers, and that's people's time, and so there's all of these things that create issues, but they're not issues that can't be solved. And we know that lots of people have solved them, like Neuromatch is a good example. They've solved a lot of these issues, and they continue to solve issues. So if we could all sort of come together with these different viewpoints, diversity viewpoint, open science viewpoint, sustainability viewpoint, trainee viewpoint, and then have really, really good representation, where, as you're saying, we don't have all of these people from rich institutions saying this is what accessibility is. I think that would be really a useful way of tackling it, so that we can't just be stopped by like these small problems.
Nikhil, did you want to? Oh, sorry,
Sorry,
Elvisha. I was just asked if Nikhil wanted to say anything, because they're on with us.
Oh no. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm not sure. Can you guys hear me? Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm not sure who exactly did it, but thank you. I guess we have talked about this bit yesterday as well. Maybe it was part of the CSIG conversation for the other group. The tricky part for accessibility is, I think, so having lived in India before and now being in Canada, it's the people when you don't have visas to travel to different places. Conferences make it a really, really useful way of having those opportunities for people who are very rarely can travel to other places, and that grows you as a person and as a researcher beyond the scope of your niche topic in research. And virtual will not do that at all. And I think to build more open science communities or build more positive collaborative communities, I think this interaction or exposure to like international research, international standards, international just moral and ethical values is extremely important. And in-person conferences really make it a big impact for students like me when I was in India, or other people who are still there probably, if they get an opportunity to come and see different places. And I think this is something we should definitely consider while we think of these virtual conferences. Yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say.
Thank you for sharing that perspective, Nikhil.
The other thing, thank you, Nikhil. I really appreciate that. And the other thing I've been pondering about since I recently became an assistant professor is we get tons and tons of applications from, underrepresented countries like Middle East, India, various other places, Africa. I've got an application from Africa, but there's no way for me to judge, if I bring this person over after all the visa issues and stuff, like how trained are they to survive in the curriculum that we have in our institutions. And I would really like to have international students. Sometimes universities help out and go, okay, this university, we know that their students can survive. But if there was a way for professors who want to be diverse and hire diverse students, if there was a way to facilitate that, to have some standardization, so we know, like, okay, when somebody says they've done a course on brain imaging in this country, this is what we expect them to know. And maybe it's like too technical, but I think that is a big barrier to also having a more diverse trainee set in a different country. Of course, in the country of origin, it's not a problem, right? So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think part of the goal, especially for the SPSIG, this year wasn't as easy just because it was the virtual format, but we definitely want a lot more representation of trainees that are not from North American and Western and European universities. And that way there can be like a dialogue between different universities sending their students to those conferences. And as Nikhil mentioned, sometimes that's hard to communicate in the virtual setting. And it may be much better communicated sort of within the sort of typical in-person large-scale international conference. And I think that's why my suspicion is the solution is not going to be one size fits all. The solution is going to be something that is going to be dynamic, and it requires a lot of experimentation. And we have to be comfortable with the idea that there will be mistakes at some point, and we will change things as the years goes on, and that's just much better. And then sort of like sticking with one approach because it's the easiest one that we have, and it's the one with the least mistakes.
I mean, I think we should also, I completely agree with everything you've said, but we also need to give ourselves a lot of credit because OHBM had been happening in person for what, like 25 years? Like it wasn't what people were used to experiencing because that was the first time it was done. And this really is the first planned virtual event that we've had this year because last year it was a very quick turnaround. It wasn't this planned. And we can't expect to recreate that same experience in 1 year that it took 25 years to optimize. And in everything that we're talking about now, all these discussions, everything moving forward, we have to realize that it's going to keep growing every single year. Everything is not going to be perfect next year or the year after or ever. Every year there will be something that goes wrong. And we have to recognize just how can we keep building? How can we keep just being positive and growing rather than focusing on everything that didn't work? It's like, what can we do to make it work then?
And also to recognize how hard people are trying to working on it. Like, I know, I started working on this particular conference as soon as the last one ended. I've probably given OHBM 3 days a week, almost every week for a year now. And I have no idea how much council members are doing extra, right? So I think it's easy to point fingers, but hard work, and I know everybody's worked super hard, so that work needs to be recognized. And also, if you want to have much more flexible meetings and things, we need a lot more volunteers because I did it for a year. Can I do it every year? I don't know. It's really going to hurt my research. I need to produce papers as well, and I'm sure it's the same for all of you, right? So I think idealism needs to also merge with practicality at some point, and we come up with different solutions.
I want to reply to Aman's point just really quick because we had the NeuroMatch Academy people come. The weeks are blending together. I don't know if it was this week or during Brain Hack last week or whatever, but we had a bunch of people come from NeuroMatch and talk to us all about how they achieved the remarkable levels of inclusivity and accessibility. They had thousands of people this past year from all over the world. We're talking about countries that they had dozens and dozens of attendees that we probably have never had a single attendee from at OHBM. And the key question is, how did you do it? The answer was they had 400 volunteers.
Yeah. Okay. I was just gonna say, yeah.
It wasn't man, their version of the open science group with 10 people is just 1,000 times better than ours. It's just that they just had so many more people, and they had people. So OHBM has chapters, local chapters all over the world. They had their equivalent of local chapters, but those people were actively recruiting people and really pushing really hard to get people to come. So there is probably a lot more that we can do with interacting with our local chapters to increase the diversity of the OHBM audience that we're not tapping into at the moment. And yeah, Aman's point is definitely true. It takes so much work to do all this stuff. I mean, you guys have been in the SIG too. You know how much work all of this takes. And I think it's more difficult actually. The virtual meeting provides more sticking points. So yes. There's in some ways it's much more work to organize a virtual meeting.
Especially
I know there's other people who want to come off, so I'm happy to jump off, but I really want to thank you for giving the chance to chat a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman.
Your perspective is always so valuable, Aman.
All right, I'm going to take Aman off, and I'm going to take Nikhil off and see if there's some other folks that want to come on.
I think Lyndon also just made a really great point.
Okay.
If he wants to.
And Stephanie Noble said she wanted to come up.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So, yeah, I think maybe Aman made my point already. There's something I was trying to say the last few days. I think we should basically reduce the amount of burden we put on volunteers by adding more and more new experiments to our organization. So let's not forget, hybrid format is going to be an experiment in a way. We'll have to actually figure it out. I know now it feels like a great idea that we're changing the world. Let's do it. We'll get it done. What happens is our deadlines come up, our priorities change by next year, and everything falls quickly in a few weeks. Things fall apart. You all know this. I think many of you have helped with some organization or the other way. Just based on what I've noticed last year and this year, I think we vastly underestimate the level of work involved, as well as overestimate the level of energy we would have. I think we know this retrospectively that people don't have that much patience now for virtual conferences, but that we didn't know last year. See, so there is always these unexpected things we have. I think it's better to stick to what is working already and change, not change too much. Hubs are a good idea.
I agree with that, because one thing that I'm going to point out, and then you can keep going, but it's different when something is just virtual versus when something is virtual and we've all been living in a pandemic for a year and a half. Let's not forget the absolute toll that has taken on us. And I would say a lot of the reasons why we've been struggling with doing this online is it's not just something we do for a conference. It's something we do like 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, every single day. And we can't escape it because of this pandemic.
And there's no other way to socialize. And so we are expecting to socialize with people we want to, but we are unable to. But I think, as Elvisha mentioned, it will be very different when you have colleagues at work and you're constantly meeting people. There's serendipitous conversations happening regularly. And then that 1 week, I think we're going to be like, I want to work from home and be in a conference and like not have to go to work this week. I think it can be like that. And so it's just, I would personally be much in favor of allowing room for experimentation, evolution of how conferences should be. As Elvisha mentioned, we had 25 years of doing it right, whatever that meant, or doing it consistently. I think we're smart enough to be like, let's just see where things go and use what others do and see what works and what doesn't work. But I want to give the stage to Stephanie and Lyndon.
Go ahead.
I think you're muted, Stephanie. Lyndon, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, I guess I just reiterate what I said in the chat, which one thing I worry about, and I guess I have mixed feelings about the hybrid model. And one thing I guess kind of counts against it in my mind is that I worry that it just ends up kind of perpetuating hierarchies of inequalities that we already have, right? And it kind of just instantiates that as the in-person conference is the real one, and it's the better one, and it's the one that the wealthy and developed nations get to go to. And the virtual version is the kind of silver medal. It's the arm that's not quite as good, and it's the one that the less developed and less wealthy countries can go to. And it might solve the problem of content access, which has come up a bit during the conference, right? It's like, well, if you have a virtual conference with recorded content, then it's easy for everyone all over the world to access it, pending internet and stuff like that. But I don't know, it kind of feels like it's also putting in writing these inequalities and saying, okay, now they're okay because we have this hybrid model, but people are going to perceive the virtual version, or I worry that people would perceive the virtual version as lesser than the in-person one.
I think that's definitely going to happen, but unfortunately, I feel like that's our only avenue to making the conference accessible to more people. And I feel like we're talking about, lowering the price of registration for the conference, but like who really, do the majority of trainees across the world have money to travel often to international conferences and to pay for a stay for a week and to pay for meals and stuff like that? I feel like we're really cutting off a huge portion of the international population. I'll say I think that there are a lot of struggles with the virtual environment. I feel like we were talking about how it'll be very different having a hybrid model where people are used to being around other people compared to where we're all in the pandemic together. I feel like actually it will be even more difficult because we're all in the pandemic. We're all kind of looking for social interaction any way we can get it through the scientific community. So we're all kind of a little bit more willing, I think, to engage in an online platform. Whereas I think that once people are back to, the in-person, it might be harder to get back into the swing of this. And it's like I think there will be fewer people who are, the people who come to OHBM a lot that will engage in an online platform. So, and then that's also part of the draw for trainees, unfortunately. But I think I just wanted to jump on. I think that a hybrid model is something that we must try if we're serious about making this conference more accessible to more people.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Like, I actually still want to try hybrid on balance. I just, voicing that reservation, I guess.
Yeah. And that's a really good reservation, because that is kind of, I think it came up before where someone is like, you don't want people to feel like they're second-class OHBM members, where it's like, I know that our conference is $2,000 USD and you can't afford it, but here you go, you get an online little version. Thank you so much. Like, there's a lot of caution about how we need to think about framing it, which is why yesterday, Roberto and Katja, or the day before yesterday, they brought up a nice idea where the regional hubs will have a virtual component, but it will also bring in researchers from that region. And that way, it doesn't really feel like it's just people at home because they can't afford to go to the actual OHBM. It's like a local symposium, and we've all been to them. I really enjoy them. And so they get what they wanted from OHBM. Again, now we're making an assumption. I assume that they will get, but we have to ask that they're getting what they want, but it's in a way that is manageable for the conditions that they have.
This is interesting because exactly the format you're talking about, the local hubs, that's like BrainHack. It's like BrainHack Global. And I feel like there's some lessons we can learn from that. Unfortunately, there's also the lesson that we learned that we still tend to not be able to attract certain groups. But I feel like Neuromatch has had a really good strategy at starting to deal with that.
I loved your point, Aki, when you said they had 400 volunteers, but I think the key is that you need to make sure that you have like critical people who lead in different regions, as opposed to like just giving volunteers all over the world, like, okay, go recruit people. It's like there needs to be branches and a really, really sustainable government system that isn't just the OHBM Council and the SIDS. It'll be the OHBM Councils, the SIDS, all the local working groups, and all of them have leaders that are at the table and that can voice the concerns of the people in the regional hub.
I think that we do have the governmental structure set up. It's just that it seems
it's not
like
utilized as optimally.
Right, local chapters aren't being utilized the way that Neuromatch does, really aggressively.
Yes.
Neuromatch will be like, in say like, Nigeria or something like that. They'll be like, why are you advertising on Twitter? We use LinkedIn, or you know what I mean? Like that's how they should be doing it if we wanted to be reaching those populations. And every different country is different in that way, like how digitally we can be reaching them for them to attend, making it known to them that up front, like OHBM is going to be free for you. Like that's kind of my dream is like the entire, like any low income country, it's free. Just come.
Absolutely.
Submit your posters. Just come. Like we want you here. We want, like, we're just doing our best to like lessen this insane divide. So come and let's have an interchange or whatever.
Someone asked what did sorry.
Oh yeah, I was also going to talk about the chat. I think you're also going to talk about the chat. Yeah, Michelle was pointing out that we need people, involved from the very beginning who are part of these groups that we're trying to recruit. And it can't really be, an afterthought, something that like the rest of the group imposes upon other groups.
Because I think it's so important to recognize, and like Hajer and I have talked about this, that those of us that are involved, those of us that are sitting here are here because we've liked OHBM enough to want to be a part of it. We're not hearing from those who didn't like it enough we're not going to come back. We're not hearing from those voices, and we weren't for the in-person conferences, and we're not for the online. And we need to bring all of those voices together, because solutions that may work for one group won't work for the other. And going back to what you were saying, Stephanie, like the content problem might be solved by hybrid, but the social one might not. So it's also recognizing that different parts of the conference will require different solutions.
I want to bring up a point that we're not talking about at all, but like the point that human brain mapping as an activity is like a super privileged activity to be doing, right? Like we are on the quest for biomarkers. We are in an insanely expensive quest for biomarkers for mental health, right? And like, just assuming that, you know, everybody needs to or should or whatever is like a little strange. It's like, yeah, you should also spend billions of dollars that could definitely be going to other things to be investigating this particular niche question that other wealthy countries are already spending the billions of dollars on.
And this is where access to, I mean, obviously publicly available data sets, although most of them are not publicly available, they're like restrictedly publicly available. So it's like a little bit of a marketing catch. But a lot of those data sets can and should be used in other countries where they're not going to be able to recruit individuals. But again, there's that huge sort of divide of, well, they're not being trained in how to use them. They don't even know that they exist.
So I do want to speak to that just briefly, because at Childmind Institute, we like create this thing called CPAC. It's this like open source Python-based neuroimaging preprocessing software. And we also have the Healthy Brain Network, which is this like massive openly available data set. Both of these things are accessed like all over the world. So it's not like no one, you know, like if you look at the country map, it's actually, you're like, wow, there are people, you know, there's so many people in India who are accessing this data and using this thing, or there's so many people in South America or in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So there are people out there. And there's also a point that Olivia Guest made a couple days ago, which is that the like low-income countries have been forced to use open science and open methods and open data sets and stuff like that. So they're actually like, people often talk about them as like behind, but they're actually, a lot of people there are way ahead in a lot of ways, because that's the only way that they can go forward, right? So like we can assume, I don't know. I feel like I'm contradicting myself and like making multiple points in sequence. Like,
no, you're contributing to nuance, because it's and it's also perspective. Like if I'm speaking to people in like Middle Eastern countries, I feel like a lot of them may not be as knowledgeable about, you know, the fact that there are all these public data sets that they can access and do data on. But again, everybody has a very limited perspective, because it's hard to get everyone's perspective. And this is where like having international like group meetings about this, like serious international ones, are really important. There's also a really nice group called HA3 BioNet, started in South Africa. And it's an organization that teaches African researchers everything about genetics, and they have figured out how to have infrastructure within the constraints of sort of the the constraints of the regions, whatever it may be. Like they understand their own constraints, and they do really well in sort of figuring out how to do bioinformatics. And so it's having those voices on the table, letting us know, like, if you're going to want to do human brain mapping in these countries, these are the types of talks that people want. You know, it's not about like motion and fMRI, because at that point it may be past the data that they get if they get derivatives, for example. And so it's giving the space for much more nuance and figuring out how to like mold things together. And one very quick idea that Elvisha and I talked about yesterday was that it may not need to be like one central conference. Like it doesn't need to be there's an OHBM week and we are constrained to that. It could be that things or events happen throughout the year, and that's where a lot of the content is being disseminated. And then there's sort of more of a social time that we decide to do, whatever that is, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I want to bring up Elizabeth Dupree's question, because I noticed that we have been talking a lot about...
Sorry, can you go? I don't know what that question is.
Oh, I will read it. It's kind of shifting gears away from more towards early career researchers. So would be curious for your thoughts on improving visibility of early career researchers in online or hybrid events. It's easy to over-rely on known names when most interactions have to be explicitly planned, e.g. who to schedule virtual meetings with. And I know that the Student Postdoc SIG does amazing work with mentoring, mentor-mentee matching, and stuff like that. So there's all sorts of different things that can be done, but curious to hear people's thoughts on helping to get trainees more visible, or at least get trainees to connect more with people. Like I know trainees who are like, I need to figure out my postdoc situation, and I'm like, oh shit, like this is definitely the place that you can do that, absolutely.
The student and postdoc said did put, again, we had our constraints this year, but one idea that we had and we put it into practice was we sent out different researchers a Google Sheets that they can fill out if they have any postdoc or PhD positions. And then we had in our SIG room a place where anybody can access that sheet and talk to those researchers. Obviously, there are like barriers there because, they would have had to see our tweet to know that we have this, form in a very particular room in Sparkle, assuming you have great Wi-Fi and CPU. So like there are a lot of sort of barriers to that. One idea I had was, I don't see why keynotes and other of the major talks can't be given by trainees. And I think that's one way to get visibility. If there's a really solid researcher who has been in the field for 5 years, even if they're a 50-year PhD student, and they have a really nice cohesive story, I think it'll be really cool for them to be given this opportunity. And that way they get visibility and they don't have to look for it. Because now everybody has to search and like fight for the visibility. But this is one way that they sort of get the undivided attention of the attendees.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question and your response to it. And it's part of the reason why I kind of wanted to come on and join this conversation, is that we do see, an elevation of certain people and certain groups. And unfortunately, part of it is driven by perceived demand. Trainees might be interested in getting to have an opportunity to meet up with a certain professor, and sometimes that could be good for their careers. I think it would be great to have more diversity, not just in terms, I mean, absolutely in terms of all the types of diversity we're talking about, but also in terms of not just people who are established in the field giving the major talks. I think that would be great. I wonder how to change the system a little bit more so people appreciate that and don't just come for the people who have just published in Nature and Neuron paper.
I think one thing that I quickly want to point out and also give a shout out to, I think it was at the racial bias in neuroscience talk or the diversity symposium today. Sorry, they're all getting blurred, but this idea of also like the cultural aspect of self-promotion and how that can be like, you basically, like all of us are based in North America right now. We're sort of taught and encouraged to be very self-promotional, but in a lot of other places in the world, that's very frowned upon. So at an in-person event, it's like those of us who are doing that are the ones that often get lifted up, but the others, it's harder for them to do the same thing. And it's how do we sort of also account for that factor to try and build more nuance into this question that I don't think we have a perfect solution to right now.
Absolutely.
That's a good point. I just wanted to say that there's no emergent session after this, unless I'm wrong. Someone tell me that I'm wrong. I don't think I'm wrong. I think that's it. But since I'm back-end host,
I don't see one.
Okay, yeah, I don't need to. We don't need to end right now. I just wanted to say that.
I can now leave. It's already 5 p.m. That's crazy.
Yeah, right.
And that means that people, I'm loving, I'm trying to balance between the chat and, actually having a conversation. But what I'm loving is that it's very clear that there's a passion for like totally reimagining how conferences are going to be. And I think that's super hype. I also had a point, but now since I'm looking at the chat, I also missed it. But Elvisha, you just mentioned about, my point was similar to Elvisha's point. If we provide a space for trainees and early career researchers to be promoted without the need for self-promotion, I think that's one way that we can really break the barrier of sort of trainees being recognized. And again, there are personality types like extroverted people versus introverted people. And so extroverted people do really well in certain situations because like they never need to be invited and they'll just like be in your face. I speak as one. But like it's important to recognize that like we also want to invite those that may not feel comfortable being in your face and sort of rethinking, like, is there a need that it's only the super famous researchers that are given the keynote lectures? You know, a lot of them, we've already seen their talks. We follow their Twitter, like they're very, like we know everything about them at this point. I mean, sometimes I sit there and like I Google their CV, like I know the year that all their papers were published. I don't think it's necessary that they give the talk all the time. And so that could be one strategy that we use.
Yeah, one point directly related to that I liked in this conference is I saw Tom Nichols give like and Karen, I think I lost her last name, give a talk that specifically went through a bunch of posters, and they actually went through and presented like something like 20 posters from groups that they weren't part of, and groups that aren't like predominantly known. So I got to learn some new people, or at least people that aren't doing exactly like in the world of what I'm doing. So I got to learn about some new people, but I kind of liked the link of like having people who have a little bit more privilege in this community kind of advocate on behalf of some groups or some individuals that are earlier career. So I like this idea of kind of coupling, I guess, an old system and a new system to help elevate.
Yeah, I like that.
I like that too.
Can I bring up oh, sorry. I want to bring up a question that will take us in a left turn. So let's like go ahead and throw out your.
I was just going to say, Pradeep's tweet that he put up, it's going back to Hajer's point as well. A lot of these keynote speakers, especially now that everything's been done online, the exact talk that they're going to give is already there online. But we don't need them to give that same talk again, especially because like you see it all the time. They're giving the exact same talk for multiple years in a row, and every conference that you go to, it's being highlighted. So why not lift up other voices?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a great point.
And now they're all online, like as you mentioned, they're literally online. Like it's not even like I have to go to a conference to see the talk for the 7th time.
I can literally watch it on YouTube. I don't need to see it.
Yeah. It's like I watched that talk months ago.
And you know when it's like verbatim, it's like even the jokes were planted at the same time. And then you're just like, see, I did not need to pay $1,000 for that one.
I didn't need to travel across the world for this.
Yeah, what if like instead of a keynote, you know, we have this like OHBM Best Poster Award thing. What if instead of giving a Best Poster Award, it was like for one single poster, they just took the votes and then they took like the top 10 posters or the top 20 posters, and then the first authors just gave all of like in a row, like it was a keynote, but it was like lightning style poster sort of summary. So we get like a fresh, you know, just a lot of fresh sort of thing. Okay, can I make my turn question? Okay. I am annoyed that the exhibit hall is full of these companies that are selling products to PIs, but they're not trying to hire early career researchers. Yeah. These companies should be hiring us, right? Like this conference is an amazing opportunity for companies all over the world to be hiring some of the best people in a variety of different fields. How do we make OHBM more friendly to early career researchers, given that most of us are not going to stay in academia and we will go on to some glorious other better paying job?
I think this actually ties really well with the point that you made at the beginning. And I think Hajer also made this point about we need to have like a career fair for us that is actually useful. And that could be OHBM. Because I am sure that if we actually were to put a lot of effort into it and plan this well in advance, we would find sponsors who would serve as exhibitors in a career fair. And I'm sure they'd be willing to pay money to be there and be able to recruit. And I think that also should be part of the decision-making of where these conferences are held. Go to a city where there are a lot of jobs for people like us. Go to a city where it does benefit us. Because like we said before, it's 50 to 60% of the conference. So why shouldn't we be prioritized?
That's a great point. Yeah.
There was another point and this is another topic of discussion I think is important. The idea of favoritism in OHBM. I don't know if I would use favoritism, but it's just the idea that it's easy when someone is in the clique, that they're just going to be part of the clique for a really long time. And so everything is sort of gravitating towards their views, and eventually they all converge in the same idea. And that's kind of how like these structures typically present themselves. And so are there strategies in which the trainees that are not part of the SID, that may not have the time to, donate, to volunteer for the SID, but we still want them on board? And of course, one of the ways is, as we discussed, having these hubs and getting them all as part of the conversation.
Should we invite Pradeep up to expand on that? I presume you had more to say on that point. It might just be interesting to get more about what his perspectives on how that unfolds for him.
Well, while we invite him in, I just want to say one thing about the favoritism. I love the idea of, Aki, that you brought up before. We could do like a top, percentile posters and highlight those. I think that whenever there are these selection criteria, it just inevitably, because of the favoritism in the system, we end up highlighting certain groups still. I think it'd be nice to do a kind of mixed approach where we, I'm going to be a little radical, add a little randomness into it as well, where there are both like the hand selected and some randomly selected posters, just because, some groups end up being highlighted again and again, and then someone will see their name and be like, oh yeah, that poster's great. Yeah. So I think it'd be nice.
I think it's easy, and I think Pradeep, you mentioned this in the chat too, where there's like these very rich labs where a lot of this ends up happening. And it's sort of like, once you're in there, that your work is going to be highly promoted. There will be a lot of people that come there just because you have these names associated with you.
Yeah, I'm actually a little, hesitant to directly call this out, because I faced a bit of setback by calling this out directly. But pay attention to the names that often come up in which software gets selected for highlights, or who is getting on the keynote stage. Analyze their first and second degree connections, who's getting the awards. I suggested the DIC to look into these stats. Not just, so one of the things that I'm trying to point out is that diversity stats are often calculated just at one cross section, like this year for one day or whatnot, right? I think what we should be looking at is over 3 to 5 years period, how many talks a particular person is giving. We all know that one person who gets so many talks all the time. We talked about that. One thing that really pissed me off last year to make that comment about only one lecture per year was Jeff Hinton giving. I take it back. What's his name? Bengio. Yeah, Ashwa Bengio. Yeah. Same talk. I like the guy, his great work and whatnot, but really we don't need to do that. INC did that just before, and we are mostly the same crowd, right? So I bet my money that there is rich clubs and there is a clear bias towards insiders. I'm happy to be proven wrong, and I that would be fantastic if we can show that. And although OHBM is definitely a much better community, much better community than some other communities I'm involved in, where I don't think I can even say this as part of the session in their conference, right? But still, there is a lot of disconnect between what people claim and what actually people do. So even sharing the nomination letters for awards would reveal a lot of things about the community, in my personal opinion, and I would love to see it. Because we hear this in outside, off the mic discussions. You all know it. You probably connected to people who make these comments too, who can say this publicly. So we just need to work to push to make it more open and actually reflective of what they claim. So that's all I'm trying to say. Thank you.
I think there's a question of I agree with the issue of the rich club issue in academia, absolutely. But there's a question of strategy around trying to lift up versus bring down, right? And I think that you have to be kind of mindful treading into that space where it's if you say, people could only do one lecture per year, then that comes across as a bit punitive, a bit draconian, and we want to avoid that messaging.
Why is it draconian?
Well, because it's saying it's giving quotas to people. I don't know that people react that well to giving quotas, and I think that you want people feeling good about solving problems rather than feeling like they're being hemmed in.
Yeah, change will cause discomfort to those losing power, Lyndon. That's the
no, I agree, but I think that like we want to like. That's why I like the idea of the poster highlights thing, and I hope that that's actually something. I mean, that was used to replace the oral sessions this year, as far as I can tell. But it's something I hope we hold on to, because I like the idea of saying, well, how can we like promote those who don't self-promote, or for whom, you know, their situations don't promote them as much, right? Because that's part of the issue. So it's like I know I prefer conversation, or I prefer strategies around how do we bring up the promotion of the currently under-promoted, rather than saying, okay, we're going to instigate rules where people can't do more than this, or they can't have more than that, right?
Yeah, so I see the point of trying to put a positive spin on it, but the thing is, if you don't have a rule that, hey, you are given enough airtime already, like how would you go around making more diverse?
But I think we need to lift people up.
It's a zero-sum game, right? It's a zero-sum game, is it not? You only have 6 keynote lectures, and over 3 years, let's say we have 20, and we know there's much more than 20 good PIs doing great.
And I don't think it has to be a zero-sum game. I don't know that I fully agree with that. I mean, I appreciate that there's only so many resources every year, and there's only so many keynotes and lectures. I get that that's true, but I don't know that it has to be viewed as a zero-sum game. I think we can make more room so that the sum to zero benefits people, I guess.
Yeah,
you wanted to make a point?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add briefly that I think sometimes I think it's good to have a bit of a balance. And I think, as Lyndon was saying, from my perspective, sometimes trainees will see people who are doing some things right, and then they'll see them criticized for one element of what they're doing wrong. And they might feel very intimidated, at least like when I was beginning out, would feel very intimidated by saying like, oh, I'm not even doing, you know, all the other things right that this person's doing right, and they're getting called out for this other thing that I couldn't even dream of doing. You know, it's hard. I think it can be a bit intimidating for people who, especially for people we know have less privilege, so don't get to do all these sort of open practices that we all want people to be doing. So I feel like it's important to be kind of careful when we punish or call people out, because other people see that, and it can create sort of a hostile environment.
Yeah, I agree.
I was gonna say, like, we need to focus more on lifting people up rather than bringing people down. And I think we have, and this goes back to the whole idea of reimagining conferences. Right now, we have in our minds that, okay, there's 4 keynotes and that's it. That doesn't have to be the case. If we have one main conference in hubs, for example, each hub could also have their own keynote. If we have events spaced out throughout the year, there could be monthly keynotes. And I think it's more just about, again, lifting more people up rather than trying to bring down those. Because if we're trying to now like lift some and like put other people's down, that's also not going to fix any of the problems that we have.
Right. So
and it'll create separation between, like, it'll be like, I mean, we see this in politics all the time where it's like, oh, you're only giving it to them because, you know, you feel bad. And that's why they're taking my spot away from me. And that's not what we want to do. And
like,
so
no one wants to be like the token keynote speaker, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So just to clarify, nobody is going to try to bring anybody down, you know? So it's about just redistributing attention, really. I think we are probably saying the same thing. So to redistribute attention, we just need some policy. One of those policies could be a particular lab cannot have more than one keynote in a, like 3 or 5 year period. That's all. Maybe it sounds negative that way, but the point being, it gives attention away to a more diverse areas.
So I actually agree with Pradeep as well as other viewpoints. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Am I live? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, you know, when we talk about good science, we have to realize that in the Western world, to a large extent, we have access. Like, brain imaging is expensive, first of all. We are the ones who have the top of the line equipment. It's easy for us to build a legacy from like cellular to brain, you know, for example, with really fancy, frontier equipment. And it's great. I think those kind of keynotes should happen. But have we thought about keynotes that, research being done in like less well-funded country, right? Where they don't have the top of the line equipment, but they do really good research. But if we try to say let this person give a keynote, I'm sure there'll be a lot of resistance because it's not maybe the top of the line, right? So that's something that really needs to be considered when we talk about like what is good research. Is good research only like the best of equipment, or is good research also tackling and doing good science in the face of less resources, right? So that needs to be addressed. I have often brought up, having ECRs give keynotes in program committee, but the thinking there is the person needs to have a certain amount of experience before they can give a keynote, right? And I don't necessarily always agree with it, but
like if you don't give someone an opportunity, how will they get the experience?
It's like that like meme that came out in like 2006, and it's like, I need experience for a job, but I can't get a job without experience, and it's like a constant cyclical thing. And it's also like another I know that OHBM prioritizes like data and research and like proper reproducible structures and all that kind of stuff. But again, in the spirit of reimagining things, there may be researchers that may have revolutionary ideas. They may not be perfectly constructed in a like reproducible structure that can be re-executed on a Jupyter hub, but they have really important ideas that the OHBM community will benefit from. And so like, it doesn't need to be the way that we've only seen it. And I went to Danny Bassett was one of the mentors for the Link with Mentors event, and she said something that I've been thinking about since. And she said, now there's this fear that every single paper we put out has to be like basically as close to the truth as possible, which may limit sort of the open, free exchange of ideas. And I think that's something that we also want to consider, whether someone's standing for 20 minutes, similar to the brain connectivity workshop style, they share their ideas, they share their perspective, and we all have a discussion about that. That may be a very worthwhile keynote that we cannot get from a YouTube video.
I think,
but I do need to caution when we say we want to give ECRs keynotes. I'm all for that idea, but we really have to be careful. Like who's going to choose these ECRs? I think what Pradeep said makes a lot of sense there. It's going to be who do you have connections with? Who's going to be your champion? And that. That's not going to be an equal opportunity ECR choice. It's going, there are going to be rich
perpetuating it more because they now get that opportunity. They now are more likely to move up the food chain and all of those things.
Yeah. Another quick point I want to mention is I didn't know that people nominate themselves for awards until like 2 years ago.
I think that's the biggest hack of
yeah, I bet a lot of international students don't know that either. So a lot of these awards are highly selective. People who already know what to do, where to let it get from. And I from what I know, people make phone calls behind the scenes to make these happen. So there is a lot of competition for these important awards because they can take these awards and buy grant money with them, to put it in a crude manner,
I wanted to get Dan's perspective because he had really nice comments. But one thing to your point, Aman, also is that I think I love that we're having this discussion and everyone's bringing a bit of nuance. But I think we also have to be comfortable with the fact that we're not going to have a perfect solution next year, but we just want to get closer. So if it is ECRs, for example, that may have an advocate who is like Dr. Carl Friston, for example, like leader in the field, and his postdoc gives a talk. That's not the most equitable that we want to reach, but it's a lot better than having the top researchers give the keynotes. So the nuance and discussion is really important, but being comfortable with taking a step forward is something that we need to do and not be limited by, but it's not the perfect solution because there isn't one, and the perfect solution will always evolve based on how we experiment. I'm sorry, Dan, Go for it.
Mm-hmm. So I was throwing up a lot of comments. So I think just following up on what you were just saying, I feel like a lot of the comments so far have been high in idealism, and idealism is important, but at the same time, it cannot be the enemy of the reality. And I feel like the reality right now is someone who, going back to kind of the starting of this meeting, someone who can get to an in-person meeting when we have an in-person meeting is going to have a better experience than someone connecting virtually, no matter what we do in the short term. I think we should actively work to narrow that, but I think denying that reality, like, and they will be second-class citizens to a certain extent if you're not in person. And I think we should work to make that as small as possible, but denying that or saying that, you know, this virtual meeting is just as good as an in-person meeting was before is denying reality. And I think having that discussion openly is also going to help us narrow that. You know, particularly for these things like getting access when you're not in the most famous labs. I can count on one hand or less. You know, I work in a fairly prominent lab. I can count on one hand or less the number of people I've had personal conversations with here who I did not know before coming to this meeting. On the virtual one, in-person meetings, I'm constantly talking to people I've never met before. And we want to improve that, but you know, in the short term, making access to the in-person meetings and getting people to be able to get to in-person meetings has no substitute in the short term.
Yeah. And that's where regional hubs can play a role, because so as Katya was mentioning, there, like, life is all about trade-offs, and so we like before it was you either made it to the in-person meeting or you were absolutely excluded and were not part of the community. Like, that was it. And we lived in that dichotomy. Now we have this virtual component, and we're like, at least you can say, listen, if you don't come to the in-person meeting, perhaps there's a virtual meeting that you can come, or you can go to your regional hubs and connect with people in your region. And that way we're still closer. We're one step closer to where we want to be, and we can constantly be shifting and iterating as time goes on. But I don't want to pit the two options together, because then we're going to be stuck with it's either in person that benefits some, or it's only virtual that benefits others.
Right. So one point, I think one important warning I want to give to ECRs, especially grad students and postdocs. Not warning, maybe reminder or unsolicited advice. The very sad reality is that your hard work and love and enthusiasm put into all these service work is not going to be as rewarded as well as it should be. And unfortunately, maybe I'm wrong, please prove me wrong, energy and time are both zero-sum resources. If you are putting it into these, I'm not discouraging you from contributing to the things that you love and whatnot, but we just have to think about it, what it goes, you know. All of these are wonderful. I think every one of us here is really strongly committed to inclusion. And I feel that every time we talk to you guys, but personally, I just request you guys to think about, is this in your priority? You know, is it going to help you with your larger goal? It's not like you're taking up a full-time career in event management. Yes, as far as I understand.
I'm like, honestly, you better pass at this point.
Yeah, maybe. And also, if you are clear about it, I think OHBM would be very lucky to have you contribute to that, you know. But my point is that I think I've been there, you know. I've been there. I suffered. People exploit volunteer labor left and right. I'm telling you, they won't say anything negative. They won't discourage you. They'll put you on all the energies. But at the end, you, as in we, will lose, right?
I think I'll challenge that though, and going back to Aki's point, Neuromatch had 400 volunteers. And so the idea is that we don't want 50 volunteers that do all the work. We want to sort of be very open with who can volunteer. And of course, there needs to be like a sustainable governance structure for sure. But we want it so that the passionate people, and there are so many of them, are able to do little things that make a really big difference, as opposed to now where we have SIGs that are 12, anywhere from like 6 to 14 people, and they're doing a huge amount of work. They're not going to be able to accomplish a lot of that. But instead, if we decentralize, I think that's going to be better. And I think, there is a movement towards recognizing the sort of soft science that we do, which is basically volunteer work to make the science better. And the people on this panel, for example, are going to be the ones reviewing grants and reviewing CVs. They have volunteered their time. They know that it's important. And so they may look at that favorably to the trainees that are doing this work. That's number one. And number two, we want it so that the burden is not on a couple of individuals. It's decentralized. And I think that there's more than enough people who are passionate about this topic to do it. So I wouldn't discount volunteership at all. And I think we are motivated more intrinsically because we want this to work. And it's just about, we have a vision. How do we make it happen? Get a lot of people on board and have a buy-in.
And I think
right. So I'd like to add to that. So yes, I mean, I love volunteering. I've done that for several years now at OHBM, and each year my responsibility increases somehow. I guess I put myself in that situation, so I can't complain. But, you know, when you bring it back to reality, volunteering is one line on your CV. And I don't usually talk about CVs, but institutions do. Institutions who are hiring you do. Institutions who give you fellowships do. So you cannot volunteer at the expense of your research output. And that is like the unfortunate reality of today. So unless we can change that structure, yes, we can change OHBM, but we can't change the academic structure at the moment. And that's what concerns me. It's like how much of our time is going into, making things perfect at OHBM, which is not really going beyond the walls of OHBM and into the reality of things. And we need to address that somehow.
Right. So also I've tried to raise money, and people say a lot of things about their commitment to various causes and whatnot, but very few people actually donate money. And it's the same thing with volunteering and actually getting their time and energy. So I'm super happy that Neuromatch was able to find volunteers, but I think it's that's basically they caught a wave at the right time and the right place in terms of getting them. Pandemic, a lot of people are home wanting to do something, and it may not be, I don't know if it's going to happen again. I want Neuromatch to succeed, but I also am realistic to our decades of experience in terms of how much energy we can count on within a given society to run a big conference and keep it in a sustainable mode. One big reason why our fees are high is because we have an executive office that we can in no way dispense with. People often criticize that, but nobody else is going to do that without the EVO, right? So all I'm trying to say is protect your time and think about your priorities too.
I also want to add on about volunteering. The Neuromatch is being used as an example, but I guarantee you if they have 400 volunteers, they have 12 people coordinating those 400 volunteers that are doing more work than the 12 people here, because that is a job in and of itself. So there's only so much, many hands make light work, but there's still going to be some people putting in a lot of work. And also volunteering is an access thing, and all these extra things are access things. I have never volunteered for a consistent thing in HBM. I do one-offs here and there. I have never been to an in-person brain hack because I try to be an active parent, and you might even hear my kids in the background right now. And leaving my spouse with a full-time job at home for a week is a big deal. Leaving my spouse with a full-time at home for 2 weeks is even bigger, and I generally don't do that. So when you're saying when everything is volunteer run, that makes things that limits who participates. And I've said many times that there are some volunteer jobs that really are things for volunteers, and there are some things that, like I think I said last year, people who coordinate this open science room and help people in and out of these rooms, that's like a professional job. That's like a task. It's thankless. It's behind the scenes. that's something that should be paid. And there's enough of the volunteer jobs here that really are paid positions. They're not what I would call something that you want an expert to donate a bit of their time to. They're something that you should pay someone for the work they are providing.
That's a good point, Dan. And it also links back to some of the diversity discussions around, like, it really is people who don't need extra money, who volunteer in labs and undergrad, and then they're part of the pipeline. And so there's that socioeconomic class barrier. So I totally recognize and respect that. And I guess, you know, it's also difficult because we have this reimagined science that I think a lot about, but OHBM cannot solve all the problems in science. But I think the main problem is, can we do science in a way that, you know, values soft science, which is what we're doing now, the same as it values hard science? And that's not a question we can answer, nor is it a question OHBM can answer. But it's within the constraints that we have. Is it possible to organize a conference, a hybrid conference, or an in-person / like alternate in-person virtual conference with the volunteer constraints that we have? That's really going to be the question. And to add on to that, to add a little bit of caution, is that it's also important not to assume people will not or will volunteer. Like, it really is, we need to collect information as to whether people are willing to volunteer or not. Almost all the SIDS have more, the chat is so lively right now, I'm really trying to keep up, but almost all the SIDS have like double or triple the number of people apply than they can accept, which means that there's a level of hunger and passion for this volunteer work. So I'm with you, Dan, 110%, with the caveat that we shouldn't assume people are not willing to or are willing to. It's just that if we can open up who can volunteer and see what that looks like, then that's a path.
I think it's also rare that you have a volunteer who you offer money to and they'll say no.
Yes. I was going to say, it is also crazy that trying to volunteer at OHBM is like fighting to get a seat at the table. And this exists at all the committee levels, like you said, in the SIGs. We need to make it also easier for people to be a part of these communities so that we can get more voices. We can just have a lot more going on, because then it would make a lot of things easier. But because of these structures that we've put into place ourselves, we're limiting who can even be a part of this volunteer structure that's entirely unpaid.
So one of the things I brought up as the diversity chair is, you know, we select individuals based on the CVs and, you know, how much diversity work they've done and stuff. And once they get selected, some people work super hard, other people never show up at meetings, right? So then I brought up the question, well, what about the people who aren't showing up? Like, but then it's like, oh, but there's a volunteer position. I'm like, yeah, it's a volunteer position, but we're volunteering to commit our time, right? So then actually Lucina brought this up, and I hope she doesn't tell me off for telling you guys this. She's like, well, it's not like we are lacking people wanting to be in the committee. So if people are really not having the time in the committee and they really can devote their time to this volunteer work, why not we get the people who actually want to be here, right? So that is one thing. But I also want to point to another thing, that yes, volunteering is a very privileged position, because, you know, somebody who is in a lower socioeconomic bracket is working full time to pay for their education, or are a single parent or whatever, they don't have time to volunteer. So are these people gonna get knocked down for not volunteering? They obviously don't get to network, they don't get the exposure, they're just like struggling to get their degree, right? So we have to consider that as well.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. Being able to volunteer is a big privilege, because oftentimes I was with the toxic PI. Every week they're asking about projects, you know, and that's not going to change. And so there's many people like that too. And second point, I just lost it. Oh, some people, like Elvisha was mentioning, compete for these positions because of their value that offers to their CV in their career interests. So we have to keep that in mind too, right? Like, they show up, get the whatever line on their CV, and then do the least minimum without actually making any difference and move on, right? Fill as many lines as possible and move on, right? So that's something to keep in mind too when thinking about this.
Sorry, guys, I just wanted to say one thing really quickly and then hop back off. Teeny bit off topic, but it's kind of big picture. So we've been having this amazing conversation for almost 2 hours, which is phenomenal. We've been having like multiple panels that I think could have gone on for a very long time in the open science rooms. And we've been having a lot of discussion. Obviously, we can see the chat is like blowing up. And it's been blowing up in sessions like this. And I think that there's been a lot of, excitement about trying to move forward, especially since we've gotten to experience some of what could happen through the virtual formats that we've been part of. And I'd love to carry on this excitement across the groups, that have been involved in these efforts, and also bringing in some of the audience members who are in the chat. I'd just love to keep this going, after OHBM, after OHBM leaves, keep the enthusiasm going, and keep this conversation going as early as possible so that we can be ready for next year. And it's not as much of a, an afterthought. I mean, I know it's usually an afterthought, but just, the way it happens is usually after the conference ends, things get pushed.
There are notes.
Steph, you should apply for a position in the student postdoc SIG or in the open science SIG or in the